Should you play Guild Wars 2 or should you play Final Fantasy XIV? The answer is actually pretty simple. You should just play both. Those of you who watch my channel regularly will know that I am a little bit of a Guild Wars fan, but that doesn't mean I hate other MMOs. Oh god. Wait, you can like multiple MMOs at the same time? What is this kind of reasonable take? I actually really enjoy the MMO genre as a whole, and Guild Wars 2 just happens to be my favorite. So last year, I went and tried Final Fantasy XIV. It took me a couple of tries to get it, but over the past year, I have been really enjoying it. I would honestly say I've become a Final Fantasy XIV fan as well. I shared a lot of my thoughts about A Realm Reborn in a review video I did last year, and since then I've also finished Heavensward and Stormbolts. By the way, just quickly letting you know, I am about to start Shadowbringers on my stream, so you should totally go check that out. I actually think that Guild Wars 2 and Final Fantasy XIV complement each other rather well, and in my opinion, playing two MMOs at the same time is like super big brain. If you play two games, you get like twice the content. But what if you only have time for one MMO? Do you play Guild Wars 2 or do you play Final Fantasy XIV? The answer is really, it depends. I know that might seem like a bit of a cop-out answer, but it is true. Both games are genuinely really good, but which one you enjoy the most depends on what kind of stuff you like. What kind of combat style do you enjoy? What kind of storytelling? What kind of gameplay loop? So today, I'm going to help you answer this question for yourself. We're going to compare Guild Wars 2 and Final Fantasy XIV in loads of different ways, and by the end, you will hopefully know which game is for you. Let's get started. We will kick off our comparison by looking at something which both of these games focus on a lot. Both games have a large focus on narrative. You are basically the chosen one, tasked with saving the world and defeating evil. However, the two games tell their story in very different ways. As I'm sure most of you know, Final Fantasy XIV tells its story through long sequences of text dialogue and cutscenes. The important moments are voice acted. But most of the story is just reading text. Characters talk a lot, and there is a lot of story to get through. Guild Wars 2, on the other hand, has a very different approach. Characters just kinda talk with each other during instances. All dialogue is voice acted, and getting through the story is a lot faster. The game never really forces you to stop and read. I would honestly say that Guild Wars 2's story is like watching a blockbuster Marvel movie, whereas FF14 is more like reading a fantasy book series. Whichever style of storytelling you prefer is entirely up to you. If you dislike reading a lot of text, you might like Guild Wars 2's story more. However, if you don't mind it, FF14's longer form storytelling is able to do a lot more character development and go a lot more in depth. If you are a story fan, and you really like sinking your teeth into a story for hours on end, FF14 is probably the MMO to play. I personally think that FF14 has some really satisfying heights, which Guild Wars 2's shorter story isn't quite able to reach. With heights, I mean crying. I really like it when games make me cry. What the fuck? Oh no. Shit, dude. Guild Wars 2 can sometimes feel like it just doesn't have enough bandwidth, like it doesn't have enough time to really go deep with its story. FF14 doesn't have that problem at all, but it does also mean that sometimes the FF14 story can have some less than ideal pacing. Especially in the core game, A Realm Reborn, there are some moments where the story just drags on and on and on. You can check my Realm Reborn review if you want to know my full thoughts on this. Personally though, I felt like it was really worth getting through those slower moments, because in the expansions the story really got a lot better. Heavensward is probably my favorite video game story ever, period. I just really loved it. That might be because I cried a lot. Besides these stories of these games, there are of course also their settings. The game's worlds. Guild Wars 2's Tyria versus Final Fantasy's Eorzea. I actually found that even though I prefer FF14's longer form storytelling, I actually like the world of Guild Wars 2 more. The different races, the continents, the history of the world. I personally find Tyria to be a more fascinating world than Eorzea. That might be because I've been a huge fan of the franchise for like 2 decades. But I also genuinely feel that Tyria feels a little bit more alive. To me, it feels more like a place where people actually live, and I think one reason for that is its open world, which brings us to our next topic. That was a solid segue, wasn't it? Guild Wars 2's open world is filled with so-called dynamic events. Wherever you go, there are NPCs talking, going on adventures and sharing their stories, and it is all fully voice acted. It makes Tyria really feel like a world which people live in, whereas Eorzea can sometimes feel like it's just the backdrop for its main story. Guild Wars 2 has a massive focus on its open world content. Dynamic events are constantly occurring, and there are also large-scale meta events, where tons of players can band together to take on epic boss fights. There is also a large focus on exploration in Guild Wars 2. You can complete maps by finding points of interest and completing hard quests. There are secret mini-dungeons and jumping puzzles for you to find. You can really spend hundreds of hours in Guild Wars 2's open world without getting bored. Final Fantasy XIV, on the other hand, has a much smaller focus on its open world. It is really not an open world MMO in the way that Guild Wars 2 is one. That is not to say that there is no open world content though. There are fates, side quests, treasure maps and hunts for you to do, but it is just not as extensive. If you are looking for an MMO with a focus on exploration and large-scale open world boss fights, Guild Wars 2 is the game that quite clearly does it better. Let me stress though, that doesn't mean that Final Fantasy is a worse game, it just chooses to focus on different things. And that brings us to our next topic. Something which Final Fantasy chooses to focus on instead is instance content. FF14 is absolutely jam-packed with dungeons, trials, raids, alliance raids and ultimates. There are difficulty settings for all kinds of players, making instance content fun for pretty much everyone. And all of these get released at a very fast pace. Guild Wars 2 has a bunch of instance content as well, which I am a huge fan of. But in that game, the volume of instance content releases is just smaller. Personally, I think I enjoy both games' instance content just about the same, but I cannot deny that FF14 just releases a lot more of it. While Guild Wars 2 has less instance content than Final Fantasy, it is in my opinion really smart about making the most out of that content. Guild Wars 2 does not have a gear treadmill and never increases the level cap, which means that all the old raids, fractals and strikes still get actively played by the player base. In FF14, most raiders are entirely focused on the newest raids. Besides roulettes, there's just not that much of a reason to go back to the older fights, especially not the really hard ones. If you are a new player and if you don't have a lot of friends yet, good luck finding a group for Sing's Coils or Sing's Heavensward Savage. Guild Wars 2's lack of a gear treadmill also means that the reward structure in instance content is very different. In Final Fantasy, new raids reward you with better and better gear, and if you are an active raider, there's constantly this drive to keep up and obtain the currently best gear. Guild Wars 2 doesn't do this at all. Once you have the best installed gear, it remains best installed forever. If you don't have a lot of time to play, Guild Wars 2 might be good for you. You can take a break and be right back in the hardest instance content instantly. In FF14, you will have to do some gear grinding to catch up. Some people actually really like that gear grind though. It can give you something to do, a clear goal to always be striving for. Alright, so FF14 releases more instance content, but Guild Wars 2 is really good at keeping the old stuff relevant. But what about the actual gameplay in these fights? What about the combats? I think the best way to describe it is that FF14's combat system is pretty similar to your run-of-the-mill WoW-like combat system, whereas Guild Wars 2 feels a bit more like a fusion of an MMO and a MOBA? I know, that sounds like a lot. Let me explain. Guild Wars 2's combat is very fast and feels a lot more like an action game. There's a Dark Souls style dodge roll which gives you iframes, and there are loads of skills which you have to aim manually. In Guild Wars 2, you rarely find yourself standing still, and certain rotations have absolutely ridiculous APM. FF14, at first glance, seems a lot more rigid. There's a pretty long global cooldown, and especially at lower levels, the combat can honestly feel quite slow. But as you level up and your toolkit expands, you get more and more skills to weave in between your global cooldown skills, and the combat gets a lot more engaging. If you found FF14's combat to be boring during the lower levels, let me reassure you, it does get a lot more engaging as you get to higher level content. I think I personally prefer Guild Wars 2's combat. It It feels more active, more responsive, and it's fun even at lower levels. It is more freeform. You can just kind of run through your skills in any order you like. FF14, in comparison, feels a lot more rigid. There's really kind of one obvious way to play. You do your global cooldown skills and you weave your other skills in between. It makes the combat pretty predictable and also less overwhelming when you're first getting started. That really doesn't have to be a bad thing. It can also be sort of fun to learn the limitations of FF14's combat and then use those to your advantage. You can, for example, do stuff like slide casting, where you move your character when you're supposed to be standing still. I guess in the end, I really enjoy both combat systems. Guild Wars 2 is more freeform and has a really high skill ceiling, which is awesome if you're willing to put in the hours, whereas FF14 is a bit more rigid and a bit easier to get into. My favorite combat system is the one in Guild Wars 2, but whichever you prefer is entirely down to your personal preferences. That actually brings us to our next topic, and it's kind of a similar story. Let's talk about Buildcraft. Guild Wars 2 has a very deep Buildcraft. You pick your traits, your skills, your weapon types, the stats on your gear. The amount of depth is pretty impressive. One elementalist could be entirely different from a different elementalist, depending on their builds. FF14 is kind of the opposite of this. Compared to Guild Wars 2, there is basically no Buildcraft in that game at all. Every white mage in FF14 is basically the same as every other white mage. They have almost entirely the same gear and everyone has the same toolkits. If you're someone who really enjoys Buildcraft, Guild Wars 2 is definitely the game for you. But again, there is something to be said for FF14's rigidity. Not everybody enjoys Buildcraft that much after all. If you are the kind of player that just looks up the most optimal builds and plays that one, you could argue that FF14 just cuts out a step. Yeah, that's me. There are also advantages to this uniformity. In Guild Wars 2, it is pretty easy to accidentally make a pretty bad build. In FF14, everyone is always guaranteed to have gear and skills that make sense. There are less pitfalls, and it's honestly a lot more newbie friendly. Also, because every white mage in FF14 is pretty much running the exact same build, Final Fantasy is able to do really robust matchmaking for instance content. The traditional tank, healer, DPS holy trinity really helps out there. The game can just easily create a good group composition with all the skills that you need. Forming a good group is much more difficult in Guild Wars 2. Roles are a lot more complicated. A firebrand might be a pure DPS, a healer with tank gear, or a boon DPS. The game doesn't know which role you are playing at all, so you gotta be a bit social and actually talk to people when you're forming a group. Some people really like that, and some other people really hate that. Oh, by the way, this seems like a pretty good moment to quickly talk about alts. Guild Wars 2 is a really alt-friendly game. Leveling up alt characters is easy, and a lot of progression is account-wise. I personally don't even really have a main character, I just kinda switch between 9 of them, which I actively play. FF14 is much less alt-friendly. If you make an alt, expect to be starting over entirely from scratch. However, FF14 instead has this really cool system where you can have multiple classes or jobs on one single character. If you want to play DPS, you press a button and you're a DPS. And if you want a tank, you press one button and then suddenly you are a tank. It is super convenient and it means you don't really need alts. You can just stick to one character and get alt jobs instead. So in the end, if you want to play multiple classes, both games do that quite well. And that is enough about combat, Buildcraft, alts and all that sort of stuff. Let's talk about something else which is really important. Production value. Both games honestly have outstanding production values. They just feel well made and polished. The characters look nice, the world looks nice, and the music in both games is genuinely incredible. You really cannot make a wrong decision here, but of course the games do have different styles. I personally prefer the playable races in Guild Wars 2. I think they're just a bit more unique. They're the humans, the super cool plant-like Sylvari, the beast-like Char, and the cute gremlin-like Asura. And then there's the Norn, the tall humans. Those are maybe not as unique. Final Fantasy instead has the humans with cat ears, the humans with bunny ears, the humans with dragon ears, the tall humans, the small humans, and the beast-like humans? Those last ones are pretty different, I guess. I personally think Guild Wars 2's races are a bit more unique, but if you really wanna play as a cute girl with cute cat ears, you might wanna go for FF14. Or actually, Guild Wars 2 does have a cat ear item. Does that count? Another advantage of FF14's races is that the developers can actually add more of them. In Guild Wars 2, the main characters are fully voiced, and every race gender combination has a different voice. I think that is really cool, and it makes the races feel really distinct, but Guild Wars 2 hasn't added any playable races since its launch, and I think the voice acting is probably a large reason for that. Next, let's talk about the music. I think this is kind of a tie. Guild Wars 2 has got some incredible tracks, especially in the expansions. I think Guild Wars 2 kinda wins for me in the open worlds, but I think Final Fantasy wins for me with its battle music. Wow. What a cool trial. I'm glad we didn't skip this.
Impressive!
Impressive?
I shall bring all to bear!
Yo, the music. Gosh, there are just some incredible epic themes in Final Fantasy's raids, dungeons, and trials. Guild Wars 2 has got some good ones too, but Final Fantasy just has so many goosebump-inducing bangers. It is really kind of wild. Next, let's talk about animations. Here, I honestly think Guild Wars 2 wins. FF14's animations are fine. They can be a bit stiff, but they're fine. Guild Wars 2, however, has, in my opinion, the best animations in the entire MMO industry. Everything just feels so fluid and responsive. Gosh, the jump in Guild Wars 2 is incredible. One of the biggest things that initially turned me off Final Fantasy XIV was that the jump just felt so darn clunky. Really, I kinda hope that one day FF14 will revamp some animations, and especially its jump. Another aspect where Guild Wars 2 kinda just feels better than FF14 is its mounts. Guild Wars 2's mounts honestly feel incredible to control. There are not that many different mounts, but they all have distinct movement abilities. The Raptor can jump really far and cross gaps. The Springer can jump really high. The Skyscale is like a helicopter, and the Griffin is basically a jet plane. Every mount also handles sort of indirectly, like you're actually riding an animal. Guild Wars 2's mounts are so cool that WoW basically copied their concepts and built a whole expansion around this. In FF14, every single mount is basically the same. They just give you a speed boost and you can float up into the air. They honestly pale in comparison with Guild Wars 2's mounts. But even here, talking about mounts, there is something which Final Fantasy arguably does better. In FF14, mounts can be rare drops from difficult content. It can feel really good to get that rare mount drop and then show it off to your friends. Guild Wars 2 instead sells skins for its 9 distinct mounts on the gem store. And they are very cool skins, but the game pretty much never gives these out as rewards. This means that in Guild Wars 2, if you see someone with a cool mount, you're pretty much thinking, oh wow, that person spent money on a very cool mount skin. You're never thinking, oh wow, that person did a really hard fight to get that mount skin. It is a little bit sad. Mount skins can be a really fun reward for playing the game, and I think it's a shame that Guild Wars 2 never really taps into that. The reason for this though is kind of understandable, and it neatly brings us to our next topic. Guild Wars 2 has no subscription fee, and Final Fantasy XIV does. Both games have a fantastic free trial with tons of content and then offer expansions with more content which you can buy. But then FF14 charges you a subscription fee on top of this, while Guild Wars 2 does not. This means that Guild Wars 2 has to make money some other way, and this is why mount skins in Guild Wars 2 are a cash shop item. They gotta sell something to make the game profitable. I personally really appreciate that Guild Wars 2 does not have a sub fee. A game with a sub fee gives me this sort of pressure that I have to play a lot to make my sub fee worth its money. When I take a break from Guild Wars 2, I can jump in whenever I want to without having to pay. If I take a break from a game with a sub fee, I feel this sort of barrier to get started again, because I have to resubscribe and I don't like spending money. What if I resubscribe, play for an hour and then just quit again? So very often, when I quit a game with a sub fee, I never actually end up getting back into it. There are also people though who argue that the sub fee has benefits. It probably does have some. Again, for example, Guild Wars 2 is much more dependent on its microtransactions. Personally though, I would pick Guild Wars 2's model any day of the week. So far in this video, I've done a lot of smooth segues, but for this next topic, I really cannot come up with any. Look, it's a Moogle! Let's talk about the social features of these games. Guild Wars 2 and FF14 are both MMOs, which means that they are inherently pretty social games. Now, that doesn't mean you cannot play these games as a solo player and have a good time. But if you do enjoy having conversations with people and socializing a bit, which game is better for you? Both games have plenty of people socializing. Making friends is not that difficult and both communities are fantastic. There are just a lot of friendly people in these games. One big difference between the two games are their server architectures. Guild Wars 2 has mega servers, which means there's basically one massive EU server and one massive NA server. Final Fantasy instead splits everyone up into smaller servers, just like more traditional MMOs. In Guild Wars 2, you can super easily play together with any friends from outside the game or anyone you meet in, for example, a dungeon. In FF14, you might need to bother with guesting to a different server, which can be a bit of a pain. It honestly feels like a pretty dated system, but FF14 does have more of that small, personal server feel. Oh, and speaking of servers, something which Guild Wars 2 does not get nearly enough credit for is its incredible server uptime. The other weekend I was playing FF14 and then the servers went down? And they went down for 24 hours because apparently they were doing big server maintenance. As a Guild Wars 2 main, this was kind of weird. In Guild Wars 2, when a patch happens, the servers don't even go down. There is no server maintenance in Guild Wars 2. Ever. Guild Wars 2 servers are basically black magic. They are always up. In 10 years of Guild Wars 2, there have only been a handful of incidents where the servers went down, and there are also no queues. When a Guild Wars 2 expansion comes out, you just log in and you just play the whole day. It is amazing. Guild Wars 2 readily wins here, and I think it would be incredible if Final Fantasy XIV would try to copy their technology a bit. Alright, let's balance this conversation out a bit. One social feature where FF14 readily wins is player housing. Guild Wars 2 doesn't have this feature at all, even though I wish it did. But in FF14, you can have your own house. You can decorate it, invite over friends, get to know your neighbors. It is definitely not perfect. There is actually a bit of a housing crisis on most servers, but it is still better than Guild Wars 2's non-existent housing. And of course, when you are hanging out with your friends, you really want your character to look good. Let's wrap up this video by talking about arguably the most important part of Endgame, the fashion. Guild Wars 2 has the incredible wardrobe system. You get an item, you soulbound it, and the skin is unlocked forever. In FF14, you can store items in your glamour dresser to unlock their skins forever, but there's only a limited amount you can store? Apparently this is due to some kind of server limitation. It is honestly a bit of a pain. But FF14 does have something which Guild Wars 2 doesn't have. In FF14 you have so-called glamour plates, which are basically fashion templates. You can kinda make this work in Guild Wars 2 using equipment templates, but it just doesn't work quite as well. Honestly, FF14 just needs to copy Guild Wars 2's wardrobe, and Guild Wars 2 needs to copy Final Fantasy XIV's glamour plates. Then we have the ultimate fashion system. And that is everything I wanted to talk about today. We didn't even talk about PvP, that's mostly because I don't play very much PvP, but we did talk about a lot of stuff. Hey you! Are you a Final Fantasy fan? Well, then I just have to quickly let you know that this week I am starting my Shadowbringers playthrough over on my Twitch channel, and you should definitely come join me for that. We have a really comfy community over on Twitch, and I am so excited to play through this expansion together. And of course, I stream plenty of Guild Wars 2 as well. That is my main game after all. You should also totally join our Discord server. We have both a Guild Wars 2 channel and a Final Fantasy channel, and there are just a lot of awesome people in there. We would love it if you join us. And that was enough shilling for me. This was the Fantasy. Thank you so much for watching.